Okay. Good afternoon to all our participants. Today, welcome to the third Buchler Phillips webinar focused largely at SMEs, but to any companies who would care to log in and hear the views of our distinguished panel. Buchler Phillips, to kick off with, in case you're not familiar with us, is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, turnaround and restructuring specialist advisory firm in the UK. We have a very long heritage indeed, and founder David Buchler will tell you a bit more about that later. Today's session is focused on real estate issues and perhaps specifically landlord and tenant, or inevitably those issues as they affect SMEs. And to that end, we have a very special guest today, Daniel Polden, who is a real estate specialist lawyer and a partner in the city firm Fladgate. We also have David Buchler, founder of Buchler Phillips. David is a chartered accountant by background and profession and is probably one of the best known turnaround specialists in the UK. You may know him better for his previous life as vice chairman of Tottenham Hotspur. He's been director and chairman of a large number of both private and public companies and hugely experienced in the turnaround space. Last and certainly not least, Marcus Gibson, who is one of the strategic partners of our firm. Marcus is a former financial journalist and the owner and founder of the Gibson Index, a research business which has a database of 70,000 smaller companies and specialisms in growth businesses and technology. So we're grateful to Marcus for joining the panel today and having access to his insight. I'll say at this stage there is an opportunity to ask questions through the chat function of the Zoom screen, and we would encourage panelists to do so. We'd be delighted to answer your questions. This is what the webinar is about ultimately, and we're aiming to be done in about 30 minutes, so you can all move on with the rest of your day. So without further ado, if I can introduce Daniel to share with us some of the insights from this area.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. David and I were just discussing when we first met about 30 years ago, I think at which time we must have both been in short track in a very different world it was. Speaking from the perspective of someone who's a transactional real estate lawyer acting for developers, investors onshore and offshore, I think what we're seeing at the moment is a whole new set of negotiations where both landlords and tenants are looking to try and find their ways through what is a pretty unique set of circumstances. In terms of the sorts of things we're seeing, clearly there's a lot of publicity about tenants being unable to pay rent, or in some cases simply not wanting to pay rent. And we're working very closely with a whole range of clients, both landlords and tenants, in ways to try and get through the difficulties. There are ways that and deal with, let's call them recalcitrant tenants, as opposed to people who genuinely can't pay, but they're a little bit more cumbersome. And as one of my partners put it, he said basically what seems to work is for both parties to get something out of a negotiation, which isn't radical, it just seems to be that. And whether it's in terms of rent freeze, lease extensions, rent cessations in terms of whether it's COVID or other issues, the concept of what is a lease seems to be up for grabs. How much it will depart from the traditional 5 to 10 year lease upward only rent reviews remains to be seen. But there's certainly a lot of talk at the moment about turnover rents coming in, which may apply pressure on SME businesses because meeting that requirement is difficult. But the one thing that we do try to do is show flexibility in our approach in working with our landlord and our tenant clients to try to reach a situation where both are able to continue with their respective businesses.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's a really good kick-off to our session today. David, what has the firm's experience been in recent weeks just pre-lockdown and during this period of the sort of inquiries we've been getting, and the sort of chief concerns from the businesses we're talking to. David, you just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. We're trying to drive the national conversation away from the medical arena to a business and economic arena, where SMEs are the backbone of this. They're the backbone of the UK economy, and they represent a very high proportion of both GDP and people's employed. A great deal of government help has been announced in recent weeks, and we want to help businesses not only react to these initiatives, but to take their own actions to get through this crisis and come out the other side fitter and stronger. Some businesses that we've been speaking to have been overwhelmed by the many elements of this recent experience. Fear or failure, not knowing where to start and who to turn to for help. Half the battle is getting started. We at Buchler Phillips can certainly help. We have a long and deep heritage, and we are independent, creative, flexible. There isn't much we haven't seen before, and our toolkit has been used in some very scary situations, both big and small, with tenants, with landlords, both sides of the fence, trying to help, trying to resolve issues and problems, and sometimes trying to arbitrate as to what is right, what is wrong, what is a fair compromise for everybody. So I do want to say that this discussion today is really about workout, not bailout. Many of you are taking part, many of you taking part are SMEs, others are advisors or independent businesses, banking, legal, property, all sorts. This current situation is going to need greater levels of collaboration and flexibility than ever before between all parties of the divide. We're happy to be banging the drum on this and looking forward to working with many of you to help get companies, businesses and individuals back on track. And I hope that helps you, Stephen, to start this process off.
Great, thanks very much for that, David. Again, to all participants, feel free to log some questions through the chat function. We'd be delighted to answer anything you care to throw at us. Marcus, if I can turn to you now. You, in a way, speak for 70,000 different businesses, largely SMEs. A huge proportion of those will have as their two largest elements of cost, staff and rent or premises. What are you hearing from your constituency?
Well, I have to say, I think the situation has gone from dark to black for many of them. You know, I think many thought they could survive a 3-month lockdown, but now it's going to be 4, 5, 6, whatever, and hopefully we won't get a second wave of this terrible virus. Things are looking quite black for quite a few of them, and there's no getting away from it. You know, to speak honestly. However, as David rightly said, you know, if you think it's all over and you don't speak to the experts, it certainly is all over. But if you do speak to the experts, it's certainly not all over, and there's certainly an opportunity to bring things round, you know, with long-term debt, long-term funding, etc., help from various sources to hold it together. So David's absolutely right on that point. I do think many of the landlords will have to look for, you know, long-term funding schemes to help these companies survive at some point. With retail in particular, the ones we've spoken to are particularly bitter that many city councils have followed Transport for London and others in closing down city centres with bike schemes, road restrictions, etc., which they say is completely anathema if you want to increase footfall. You know, in many ways, the car is the economy. And if you're in retail, you want as many people to come in, buy a lot. They need a car to carry it home, obviously. So they see these, it's maybe a sideline for other businesses, but certainly parking is a very important aspect. And they don't see the new restrictions as being of help whatsoever. We've also heard there's quite a lot of interest quietly arising from Hong Kong. This may be due to the, the political frictions going on there, and at least a minority of people who believe that maybe it's all over for Hong Kong and it's time to look for other places, which is not a nice thing to say, but if it's true, then maybe there are retailers and tenants and landlords in London who can soak up that interest in the coming months and years. Vis-a-vis other companies, we see the manufacturing downturn in China and to some extent the big opportunities for reshoring to be quite a very, very interesting opportunity for British manufacturing if they in turn can soak up that manufacturing demand. Equally, in the rural areas, if many people don't go abroad this year but take a holiday at home, that could be a boon to their business. So in many ways, if you can find the market and tap it, and everyone works together on this, there are certainly some bright lights ahead.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's great to have some views from the coalface there. That's really excellent. Okay, well, without further ado, let's move straight to some questions. And we've had a few through the chat function, which is great. First one is from an unnamed participant with a numeric title, but no matter. Do the panel believe that turnover rents, a way in which the fortunes of the landlord are more acutely aligned with that of the tenant, will be or should be more popular and acceptable by institutional investors and their lenders? If so, how could obligations in respect of interest payable to lenders be fixed? Daniel, that looks like it's got your name on it.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that turnover rents exist. And in fact, in many of the shopping centres or multi-let buildings of that nature, a number of tenants, particularly the large ones, have turnover-related clauses in their leases. And they work. There's a little bit more creativity. And in fact, in any commercial enterprise where there is income generated and interest has to be paid to banks, lenders and borrowers find a way to make it work. It needs a bit more thought perhaps going to it. Maybe there need to be thresholds, maybe there's a sharing of different elements of the uncertainty. But there are certainly ways in which that sort of thing can work very well. I think, as I said earlier, one of the challenges may be that the term turnover rent is very easy to say, but it's not quite as easy for smaller organisations to necessarily have the systems that feed in the way that landlords would like. But again, with a little bit of effort and creativity, these things can be made to work. Whether there'll be a total jump away from the fixed rent to something which is purely linked to turnover of an underlying business, I'm not sure. I think in certain cases, we may see moves to operators of a business, particularly in office buildings, rather than a tenant who is paying an amount of money. But that's a not dissimilar approach, because the landlord has an operational business which sits in there, making sure that the place is full and that income is generated. So the wishes of landlord and tenant do become much more aligned.
Great, thanks very much, Daniel. That question, it transpires, was from Simon Cantor. Thank you very much, Simon. David, on the same area, do you have any anecdotal evidence of how things are shaping up in the central London area, without naming landlords, obviously, but what have you seen?
You know, the the position now is that the alignment between landlord and tenant has now turned full circle, because it is absolutely in the landlord's interest to keep a premises occupied, and it absolutely is in his interest to ensure that the tenant is a tenant that is successful and can meet rental obligations. From a tenant's point of view, any tenant going back, particularly into retail or restaurants or fast food type situations, really don't know where their turnover is going to be, or where it's coming from, or how they're going to be able to survive over the next 6 months or the next year, because this whole situation is unprecedented. So working on a turnover rent, I think is very sensible for both parties at the moment, because it helps the landlord help his tenant to make sure the tenant can survive, and it helps the tenant to know that the rent is going to be based on what actually he's bringing in. There is a particular organisation of 30, 40 outlets at the moment that we're advising that is approaching all their landlords, likely to be through a CVA, a creditor's voluntary arrangement, to reorganise their lease obligations in respect of having turnover rents across the board. And for those landlords that don't want to meet any obligation for a turnover rent through the CVA, the lease will be disclaimed. And it's quite an interesting way of going about, but this, the directors feel, will certainly save the company and enable the company to carry on trading in the future, perhaps with a smaller number of outlets, but in a way that actually makes sense. So I do think turnover rents are going to be quite important moving forward.
Great, thank you very much, David. Let's move on to another question from Scott Bethel this time. Scott asks, do you think the government will extend the period of the moratorium? I think some landlords are holding off from negotiation, waiting on this. Daniel.
I suppose the short answer is yes. I think it's important to remember that landlords do have things they can do, because even though rent may not be being paid, it's still due. Landlords can still sue. Landlords can enforce judgment. Landlords can issue statutory demands, even if they can't do anything with them. But looking at the way things have moved so far, I'd be surprised if the government don't at least want to get things through the summer. The furlough schemes look like they're slowly coming to an end. So I'd be very surprised if one day landlords can do nothing, and the next, without notice, there's a free for all. I'm sure there's a lot of concerns. David said the idea of turnover rent is great as long as there's turnover, and if there isn't any, there's not much you can do. But the likelihood, and I think particularly one of the things that we're finding at my firm, is that our property litigation team and our transactional team are working far more closely with clients, trying to find ways to deal with things. In some ways, the litigators are disadvantaged because there's less they can do. But in others, it does focus the mind far more, coming back to what we, I think, all said, which is trying to find ways to work together so that when we get through this, we've got surviving and successful businesses.
Very useful. Thank you very much, Daniel. Next question is from John Crow, who asks, do you have any info on the UK government intentions re-extending 3-month eviction ban for commercial leases, or if not, any likely date for an announcement of that? that area. David, have you any guidance on that you've had?
I think the answer is that it's likely to be extended to the 30th September. But there's a whole discussion going on at the moment. There's a new bill going through Parliament at the moment, dealing with all of these points, and we probably won't have an answer until, I think, next week. But it is likely, I think, that some of the terms that the government the government are allowing to help tenants in their business situations will be extended for another few months.
Marcus, have you any experience in recent weeks of some of the companies you're in contact with saying that whatever deals they're able to do, in reality they're going to go under because of rent issues?
Yes, I think I would say it's not necessarily just rent, as you can imagine, Stephen. It's the cumulative impact of all the bills coming at once. I think most companies psychologically were sort of ready for 3 months of not much money and all the bills. But the fact that it looks though it's going to be maybe the rest of the summer before they start making any real money, is a nightmare. And I think an increasing number will just, I think mentally they'll choose just to go for closure rather than carrying on, and especially with debts they can't see an end of. So there is I now see a real danger there.
Great, thanks for that. Then, and as we said at the beginning, that the key to work out rather than bail out is to get help, however difficult it is to ask for that help, sooner rather than later. You never know what might be possible.
That's certainly right.
Okay, another question, this time from Michael Ziff, who asks all the panelists, where a tenant is refusing to negotiate sensibly and can afford the rent, and is a FTSE 100 company or a large business which has been opened through the pandemic, what would you recommend landlords to do? Daniel?
I'm so glad I've been rebranded a property litigator, and I hope my colleagues are very proud of me in my knowledge. There are certain steps that a landlord can't take, and if you have a FTSE 100 tenant, the likelihood of wanting to forfeit that lease has got to be remote anyway. So the inability to forfeit probably doesn't matter. The difficulty is in focusing people's mind on paying, that it's now more protracted in getting that payment through. It is possible to sue for rent, and it is possible to take steps to enforce the non-payment of rent. It is possible to issue a statutory demand. It's just not possible to wind up the company, but then you probably wouldn't want to anyway. So I suppose my easy advice and recommendation, Michael, is I won't go and speak to your lawyers, but come and speak to me and to my colleagues, and I'm sure we can assist you. But I think the overriding element of this, and there's no doubt there are many companies who are taking this as a credit control exercise in terms of preserving cash in the business because future needs and opportunities will arise, is that there are things you can do. It's just not as easy. And the trick has to be, coming back to again what I said earlier, ending up somewhere that both landlord and tenant, both parties, are content, and with a view to an ongoing relationship when things do return a little bit more to normal.
Thanks, Daniel. We're getting close to our time, so if I could ask each of the speakers just really to sum up, starting with you, David, what do you think would be most useful for our participants to take away from this session and bear in mind over the coming weeks? You'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. For me, it's fairly simple. The the ability for landlord and tenants to negotiate with each other is, I think, a precursor to finding a new way forward for business in the years to come, which brings landlords and tenants far closer together, and with a mutual recognition that they depend on each other. Michael Ziff's question, of course, goes to the heart of this, where if you can't negotiate anything, and there are parties, whether it's landlord or whether it's tenant, that decide that they're going to really play at the very edge rather than play in the middle of a negotiation, then that does make it very difficult. And then everybody has to look at their own rights and see which way they can go, whether it's through a CVA or whether it's through a landlord trying to find ways of locking the doors and taking the premises back. So I think, from a personal point of view, the message for today is seek help. As I've already said, we at Buchler Phillips have been in the business for donkey's years. There probably isn't anything that we haven't seen in terms of how to deal with things, and Fladgates as well, a great firm, a firm that I've worked with for many years. They know their stuff as well, and Daniel knows his stuff. There are lots of other experts out in the field as well, and seeking help and seeking guidance is one of the most important messages for me that would come out of today, to try and preserve your business and to try and ensure that the business will go from strength to strength in the future and survive beyond this pandemic.
Great, thanks very much, David. Marcus, unmuted. Can you just unmute yourself? There you go.
Here we go. The next 3 months are crucial, I think, for especially the smaller end of small companies. One thing we did hear of was a landlord who had agreed to take a modest stake, in one of his tenants' businesses as a sort of an article of faith that they could get through with that together. Now, of course, it's not a solution for everybody, but I thought it was a very nice gesture in its own way, and one that maybe other landlords can consider taking if they think it's a good punt. And we're on the second day of Royal Ascot today, so I think we're not wearing our top hats, but we really ought to be. Everything's at risk, so let's take a risk. Everyone's got to take a risk over the next 3 months and work hard to make sure we get through this with as many survivors as possible.
Thanks, Marcus, for that positive message. That's really helpful indeed. Daniel, the floor is yours to...
Thank you, Stephen. I just realised, as Marcus mentioned, top hat, that I clearly left mine in my cupboard today. I should really have been wearing it. I think, picking up on what both Marcus and David said, a holistic approach is most important. Getting advice, getting guidance, how to try and deal with things so that you can take them forward, and being sufficiently open-minded that you will consider ways to deal with counterparties that perhaps you haven't looked at before. Don't just go to your property lawyer or to your insolvency practitioner or whatever. Get your advisory group together, talk about things. What seems like a very easy yes-no answer isn't always that, but do keep at least part of your focus on what's going to be the situation with your relationship with your counterparty when we do come through this. There are already elements of it. Shops are beginning to open. People are beginning to do some business, but albeit under huge pressures. I think a holistic approach, which is the way I've always tried to do things, I know David has as well, preserving that as a way forward, I think, is paramount.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to Daniel and to our other panelists today. And thanks to the participants for joining, and also for your kind comments towards the end. It's been great fun having you. We hope you all found it interesting. And we look forward to seeing the participants, at least, again in the next few weeks on our further webinars. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Stephen.